Welcome to the season 4 finale of the Linen Suit and Plastic Tie podcast. This is the podcast where we dissect and analyze and investigate and explore and celebrate the amazing, epic, awesome, awe-inspiring power of storytelling and learn how to harness that power in our everyday lives. I'm Gaurav.
And I'm Kevin.
Kev, season 4 of the Linen Suit and Plastic Tie podcast is done. This is the season finale in our last episode of 2024. How does that feel?
I mean, looking back at the roster of expert storytellers we were able to connect with this season and just the amount of lessons we've taken away from talking to them and from hosting the show ourselves, I think this is, again, another really fruitful year where we've truly learned so much once again.
Yeah, it was a little bit of a shorter season this year. Things got busy, life. But I'm so proud of how eclectic our season was. We had so many diverse storytellers from all different parts of the world, all different experiences, from a Harvard Business School senior lecturers to a sound aficionado. Like, Dallas Taylor was such an amazing guest. Like, I know how nervous we were to make the sound perfect, but he introduced us to a whole world of storytelling just via sound and kind of the way your brain unconsciously processes sound as part of the story of your life and how you can use sound to not only augment storytelling, but like augment mood and the story. And it's just a testament to how we've barely scratched the surface of this in 4 seasons.
Yeah. And I think when we are just going about life and you run into things or scenarios of people that remind you of the storytellers we talk to, right? Every time we go see an IMAX movie and we look at the opening, it's a cool feeling to know that we talked to Greg Pliska, who worked on the orchestration of that IMAX intro score. And of course, this year, when we both went to San Diego Comic-Con for the first time, we actually ran into a lot of the expert storytellers.
Yeah, we ran into more than one, and that was kind of beautiful. Or when we walk into a bookstore and we find a book from a guest, like that's amazing too. We had our first New York Times bestseller this year.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we reflect a lot about the stories that made us, right? When we had Isabel Howe on the show, the Stanford education innovator, and we talked about how important storytelling is in education. The way not just help kids learn, but how those early stories you're told in education, the way you interact with other people, whether it be educators or friends, or the opportunities you have, shape how you grow. You are the stories you consume. And in this past year, we've saw so many amazing stories in the world of animation. The Batman animated series or some of the early Spider-Man cartoons helped shape me in my educational experience. And now we're seeing animation come to this new realm where we are learning so much and you see them for all ages. And I think that's pretty beautiful.
Yeah, we're seeing such a renaissance of animation across so many different mediums in the past few years, which is very exciting. Just at SDCC, if you remember, there were 2 things I cared about the entire time. One of them was a video game, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, that came out this year, and the other one is Spider-Verse.
Something we really thought about this year, or at least I thought about a lot this year, is that there's always going to be a part of storytelling that's kind of unexplainable, that's kind of magical. Even when we talk to Nuala Walsh about the neuroscience behind storytelling, right? We know it has scientific implications, but you can't really explain it. And this is the thing that animation allows us to do, is to lean into that theme of like, you're not going to be able to explain everything in scientific terms. And animation allows us to deal with really heavy and deep emotions. Like Inside Out 2, which was an amazing film, the way they described anxiety, they use these characters that are a little bit easier to digest. I didn't feel like I was being lectured. I didn't feel like it was a symposium on the psychological analysis of anxiety. And I felt seen in that way where I'm like, oh, that's how I feel about anxiety. Even if I can't fully explain it, Like seeing that anxiety character, I'm like, oh, because we can use fantastical storytelling methods, things that you can't really do in live action. Animation allows us to take more risks and actually tell more true stories about humanity.
Yeah, I actually asked my parents to go see Across the Spider-Verse in theater. I thought there was a great conversation between the parents and the children where it really explained both sides of that relationship, of that family ties pretty well. And they loved it as well. That it was not something, animation wasn't something that they usually consume, but they agreed with how that story was executed and told me that, that is kind of the message we want to tell you as well as your parents. And we understand what you're trying to tell us as our son. So it's pretty incredible.
That's beautiful. I mean, we can use stories to communicate. Even if we can't find the words, even if it's fantastical, honestly, because it's fantastical, because it's harder to see it and relate to a real human going through that. But seeing it in an entertaining way can make you feel seen, can make you have that connection. And I think something else that's really important here is that the entertaining part comes first. Not to push a narrative, not to teach them something, just to entertain them. And you can have the capacity to help have these deeper conversations and help us feel more seen and create empathy. The way storytellers find that balance in animation is absolutely stunning.
And now that you have said that word a few times, I actually decided to Google what's the adjective form of fantasy. I
I
think
don't care.
we
I
can
don't
just
care. I
say
know it was wrong. I
fantastic.
know it was wrong. It's a word now. I'm going to use it.
And I think having seen Wicked in theater, I feel like I know where that came from.
No, I've said fantastical for a while, but yes, I would
Uh,
love to use more Wicked words. I've been a big fan of the Wicked musical. Can't believe you brought it up. I could talk about this for hours, but I've seen the Wicked musical on Broadway. I think it's the greatest story ever told. I love Wicked. So if we can all use more Wicked, fantastical, and wickedful, and ideologicalness, the world will be better. I stand by it. I would love to live by Wicked rules.
and with that, let's head on over to our conversation. That'll wrap up our season 4. We welcome back Dr. Drea Letamendi. Drea is Associate Director in Mental Health Training, Intervention, and Response at UCLA, our alma mater. She also co-hosts the Arkham Sessions podcast. One of our favorite guests, obviously of all time, someone who is a true expert in psychology and comic book, pop culture, animation, and beyond, who is really able to connect and distill psychological and storytelling lessons from some of the most popular and our favorite stories in the world.
Every time we talk to her, it is an incredible exploration of storytelling. So we have her for a little bit today to talk a little bit more about animation and storytelling.
Here comes Drea.
Hello, how do you do? Sit down, gather around. We've got stories about stories that'll mix you a drink of wonder and mystique. 'Cause life can be dry, better dressed for the times with the linen suit and plastic tie. Linen suit and plastic tie. Now here's Gaurav and Kevin.
To kick us off, Drea, welcome back, first of all, and tell us a little bit about yourself again. What is your story?
Well, thank you so much for having me on the show again. It's such a pleasure to catch up every once in a while and see how we're all doing. So I am a licensed clinical psychologist. I serve the UCLA campus as a mental health leader and consultant and trainer. I do a bunch of mental health related things like drive initiatives, advocacy work, training work, consulting work. And it's such a pleasure to have such a unique role there as an implementation clinical scientist. Outside of that, I am involved in media psychology. So I bring mental health science into broad spaces like entertainment, technology, and education spaces, whether it be consulting with the studios here in Los Angeles about their storytelling that we see on screen, or going to various places to train individuals, employees, teams about psychology and mental health in their workplaces. So I've been pretty busy since the last time we talked. I don't think that's a surprise to anybody, but it's been super enjoyable, and certainly there's a ton of work ahead. So I'm really excited to talk more about how we can bring storytelling and psychology together.
Yeah, I mean, you're one of our favorite guests. You've been on our show a few times now. And it's amazing to think, like, you were our seventh guest. Like, I think episode 7, Kevin.
Yeah.
And man, that was like 3-4 years ago at this point. Well, this is our 11th episode of season 4. So it's just amazing to think about how much has happened, and it's been a crazy few years. So we always appreciate you coming on. I think one of the things we loved about our first episode with you is it was a transition point for the show, because I think when we started, this was very much a business show, right? We were like, okay, how can we present ourselves better? How can we communicate better? How can we tell better stories in interviews and presentations? And your episode was the one where we started talking about mental health and the stories we tell ourselves and the stories we consume. And it really drastically changed our show, where now a lot of our shows about you are what you consume storytelling wise. A lot of our shows about the way you communicate to yourself. A lot of our shows about the way our stories infect the world around us. It's funny to look about how drastically different our show has changed in 3 years.
That's amazing. And I think, too, any kind of ongoing conversation is about that journey, how we're learning together, how we're weaving this giant fabric, this collective fabric together. And even as you talk about the conversations that we started with, I still think there's plenty of space here to connect our mental health storytelling and how we professionally see ourselves. Like, what is that journey in the different spaces? If we can say, like, these are our spheres of influence professionally, how do you want to manage and influence your professional sphere? Certainly, your story is really important. And it's such a great joy to be a part of this journey with the both of you and see how far the two of you have come in this journey as well.
I can't listen to those first season because, man, can you not hear us? It is absolutely horrible.
Yeah, whenever someone asks me about the Arkham sessions and I tell them it's about the psychology of Batman and that the very first season is all about the early 90s series, Batman, the animated series, there's a part of me that's a little reluctant to tell them to start there because that's first season and it's imperfect and our sound isn't that great. Our music is like, the very first iteration of that. So it's very humbling to tell people, start there and then just keep in mind it improves. Things get better. The sound quality gets better. Our conversations get better. Even our experiences get better, and we have better examples. So, I think there's something to be said about that humility and sense of development when it comes to podcasting.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have enjoyed following along your journey as well over the past few years. And I know that for this year, you have expanded on your kind of quest for storytelling. You've been hosting a keynote workshop called Storytellers. And of course, over the past few years, we've seen a lot of diverse types or formats of stories for our general audience, and animation being, one of the huge one and is one focus on your study and your content as well. So I wanted to kind of see it from your perspective. How have you seen the animation scene evolved in the past few years? What excites you particularly?
Sure. So when I talk about media psychology, for me, I'm really focused on entertainment media and entertainment-based storytelling. So what we're seeing on screen, whether it's television, film, and whatever genre, right? Animation, live action, fantasy, science fiction. These genres are so compelling and have so much opportunity, so many different ways to engage us. And when I speak with my audiences, I have different types of audiences that I speak to, but my keynote about storytellers is actually specifically for mental health providers. So therapists and counselors and social workers who are interested to some degree in media literacy and bringing that into their practice. And so when we talk about animation, it's bringing in that creative art style and bringing in that creative art storytelling into the ways in which they engage their clients and into ways in which they can tell their own stories and connect to the stories of their clients. So for animation in particular, it's so vast, it's so limitless, and it can actually transcend and even bridge worlds for us. The kinds of animation that I really like, I like anime a lot, but stories like the Marvel's Across the Spider-Verse movie series, I thought that the storytelling around Miles Morales was really compelling. This is the new Spider-Man, who's this biracial youth who already knows about Spider-Man. Spider-Man exists as a character, and young Miles Morales is essentially trying to actualize his own identity, like find himself in with the backdrop of a world where superheroes already exist. And the reason I bring up like a movie series, like an animation movie series, or even an anime series, when I talk about media engagement, is that it's not kind of a one and done story. There's something pretty dynamic about the flow and development of these characters, or you can kind of follow the different stages. This is what psychologists and counselors do a lot. We don't think of things in a static way, like this is how it is and that's done. We are constantly thinking about how individuals pass through and navigate an ongoing journey. And so animation in particular, especially if it's a series, can help us follow protagonist in their hero's journey and go through the setbacks, the failures, the mistakes, the self-doubts, the imposterism, and then go through the different ways in which a character like that can overcome those troubles and overcome those challenges. And for me in particular, what I do as a psychologist is I kind of like take those themes and bring up, what is imposter syndrome? What is it like being biracial in a monoracial superhero world, which any superhero world and any world we live in certainly is fairly monoracial in terms of our sort of cultural dynamic. So hopefully you're picking up on what I mean by that, this kind of like rhetoric that a lot of us kind of have to grapple with and then see in our lives. What is that sense of in-betweenness? What is that sense of thwarted belongingness for little Miles Morales? And how does that storytelling just get us a little bit closer to understanding ourselves?
It's a really interesting and important conversation. We talk a lot about on the show the importance of diversity in writers' rooms and diversities in the characters we see on the screen, but also in the diversity of types of storytelling you consume. It's like it's not about just reading or just watching TV or just watching movies or just reading a certain type of books. It's about visualizing and experiencing different points of view. And that's kind of this, we're in this really interesting space of animation where I feel like we're allowing animation to explore really deep and different topics and making it such a healthy part of our media diet. Miles Morales Spider-Verse is a great example of it deals with a lot of really heavy stuff. If you read the comments or if you watch the movies, Miles Morales comes out of the death of Spider-Man, right? It is a character that comes out of an iconic death. Puss in Boots was another movie that came out in the last few years. The most recent one, I know there's been like 12. I've only seen the most recent one. But the most recent one talks about panic attacks in a way I've never seen on screen. And it is interesting where we can explore these kind of unexplainable things because we have these realms of visualization, that you can't in live action.
Absolutely. There's an acceleration of meaning and connection that some would say happens in animation storytelling in different ways. Certainly, live action can offer up a lot of ways that we can tune into our own psychology and emotion regulation. And I talk about live action all the time, but my podcast started it was all about animation, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I do have kind of a personal connection to animation being, for me at least, kind of like the cornerstone of mental health storytelling.
Can you expand on that a little bit more? Why animation?
For me, what I find in animation is its intelligence.
Mm.
Certainly, I've been watching animation since the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s. And you might think, like, well, wasn't it kind of just Looney Tunes? Like, why is that compelling? And I think for anyone listening to the show who wonders about that, check out Gargoyles, check out Batman the Animated Series, check
Hmm.
out, oh gosh, check out X-Men. I'm sure a lot of folks have tuned into the recent Disney resurgence of X-Men, but the original X-Men comics and the original X-Men animated series is incredibly complicated and offers up so many dynamic stories about the self and our relationship with others and our finding our place in the world. So, yeah, I think to directly answer your question, maybe what is really happening is that a lot of animation comes from a source of media like comic books and comic book storytelling that is actually incredibly rich when it comes to mental health and psychology. And that's probably where that connection started for me.
It's something I've been thinking about a lot recently. One of the most powerful parts of storytelling and myth making in general is explaining the unexplainable. Because I think over the last 50 or so years, or not 50, longer, we have become very, very, and rightfully so in so many important ways, science based organizations, not organizations, science based societies, where we have gotten so obsessed with explaining everything in a scientific term that it's getting harder for people to take things seriously that you can't explain. But I think there's so much about the mind and life that you can't explain. And I think that's the beauty of animation, where it's using visualizations. It's allowing us again to explain the unexplainable without having to make the suit look real in Iron Man, you know? It allows us
Yes.
to be more creativity inclined. And just because we can't explain it doesn't mean it's not real, doesn't mean you can't connect emotionally on it.
Yes, I just presented at Los Angeles Comic Con on a couple of panels, and one of the panels was all about Studio Ghibli. And if you're
Mm.
familiar with Studio Ghibli animation, there's, first, it's such heartfelt storytelling typically, and they're all very different, but typically there's a connection between nature and the protagonist's journey and this like bigger collective connection that's going on. And what we talked about were, topics like climate anxiety and climate dread and this kind of collective liberation. What does it mean to be free as a human being? But then how do humans and plants and animals and nature and the environment that we're in, where is the harmony and where is the disharmony? And what are we doing as humans to reconnect rather than disconnect, which I think in our world of technology, we're seeing a lot of in our communities. So just as another example, all of the Studio Ghibli films speak to what you just said, right? And if that were live action, I think we'd ask a lot of questions like, how is this happening? And
Hmm.
how are these beings able to exist? And what are these liminal spaces? How does this happen? But in such creative, otherworldly, fantastical animation like Studio Ghibli, the fantasy of it becomes so direct
Mm.
that you kind of your brain includes it. Your brain just kind of integrates it into the storytelling, and it's such beautiful storytelling. I highly recommend, if folks haven't checked it out, to look up those films.
Yeah, I mean, there's also, I think, something to be said about when you see actors and humans playing characters, actors, even if you can totally disassociate, it's harder. I think I think there's something there that it's so much harder to just follow that story. And we're in a world where technology is getting so much better, where you can do live action animation in a weird way. Like I think about the Lion King movie, right? The live action Lion King movie, and I'm like, yeah, but I don't know if I needed that. Like, I think I connected with the cartoon so much more because I was able to disassociate and be like, oh, it's a cartoon. I think the most powerful thing about adult animation for me in general is that they don't talk down to your audience. I think about like Rick and Morty. I think about Batman the Animated Series, where it's like all ages, or Rick and Morty, I don't know, but all ages can watch these cartoons and get something out of it because they're not talking down to you, and because storytelling is universal no matter where you are in life. It doesn't have to be targeted to a certain age group. There's universal feelings that we've all gone through.
Totally agree. Absolutely. And there's something nostalgic about it too when we're thinking about the kinds of cartoons and the kinds of storytelling that we may have been exposed to as children, that going back to those stories might feel a certain way for us. And so, like, there's just lots of layers here where, yeah, a lot of benefits to draw from when it comes to animation, both from, from 20, 30, 40 years ago, and also current animation, that it just continues to be really intelligent writing.
Yeah, and I actually spent a lot of time this year just watching or rewatching some of the cartoons or the anime I used to love as a child. And it's such an interesting journey because when you watch the same thing, but now with an adult lens or more of a grown up lens, you start noticing themes that you otherwise wouldn't have noticed when you were 5, 6, 7 years old, where I was watching, stuff like Digimon or Pokemon, some of those really, really huge anime from late 90s, early 2000s, where some of these characters are actually really complex. The bad guys also had very justifiable motivations, and some of the disagreements between the different characters, nobody's necessarily right or wrong. They all have their justifiable approach. And it kind of, I think, reinforces your great memories from childhood, where having realized how much thought and effort and how great of a story it is looking back, I felt better about my childhood for having consumed those fantastic stories and allowed those to shape kind of who I am.
I was recently presenting at a psychology conference about the power of pop culture and storytelling in the therapy room, again,
Mm.
talking to kind of like counselors and psychologists about how we use stories. And it was an awesome like panel discussion. And we received a lot of questions from folks who just wondered, what is the entry point, and what are the strategies to start talking about pop culture storytelling. And I think there's something kind of like demystifying about this conversation we're having, right? And the conversation I had there, where it's not overly complex even when we're talking about the therapeutic aspects of media storytelling and animation storytelling in particular. And I told the audience, you could start by just asking your client, just ask them, what did they grow up watching or reading
Yeah.
or listening to? And who comes up for them as a character who they feel is like them, or who has traits and characteristics that they find really admirable. I even ask therapists to start with their own story just to help demystify this, right? Like, maybe start with what this is like for you. What characters do you connect with? Think back to your childhood. What characters were you just enthralled with and wanted to be like? And, what's that movie you just kept watching over and over and over again, right? And that seemed like a good way to kind of normalize and humanize this. It's not overly complicated, but there is also something deeply scientific when it comes to the neurobiology of storytelling, all those different pathways in our brain about what comforts us, what scares us, what inspires us. This all comes from the storytelling that we were raised with.
Yeah, I mean, I've been in therapy for almost 9 years now, and I have read books on anxiety. I learned a lot about anxiety from Inside Out too. Like it made me feel seen in weird ways, and having a story to contextualize and ask yourself the question and kind of visualize someone else in a fantastical way going through it without having to see it live action. There's something amazing about that, where it's like it didn't have to be realistic to teach you something. And that's the beauty of animation, not trying to be something that's not, just leaning into that form factor.
I also love stories that have some areas or places, maybe gaps, where the story isn't super clear. And so
Mm-hmm.
the consumer then is able to portray or kind of like project, actually.
Fill in the
That's a
gaps.
better word. Yeah, project their feelings, ideas, and wishes onto the story. I feel like Studio Ghibli, their animation is a little bit like this, like, wait, what is happening? It's just so fantastical that um, sometimes you just bring your own story into that. But I think that also kind of helps people to draw out their own chapters, if you will, of their own storytelling and kind of bring that to light to them. There's a term for this. It used to be called parasocial relationships, which I know you're familiar with, but we now use the term mediated others. Mediated others are the characters, the stories, that portrayal of something that we experience through creative media. And how we relate to those mediated others says a lot about our own sense of self and how we see the world.
And of course, we can talk for days on end about the various ways that storytelling impacts and fascinates us. But to be mindful of your precious time, Drea, here comes Suspenders, which is where we ask you a fun random question that can really be about anything. And you can give us any answer you feel like. And question of the day is, what is one thing from the COVID era that you're glad is gone? And one thing you're kind of sad that we left behind?
I'm gonna say something just from my experience about the first part of this question. Like, what am I glad is no longer present? I want to say that the disconnection, the very pervasive struggle to be with one another. Of course, we found ways to innovate and revise community building, but the first 6 to 12 months of COVID really put us in a difficult place in isolation with the human need to be connected to one another. So I don't miss that loneliness. For some people, it was incredibly hard. And having worked, I work at a university where we saw how this impacted young people who were internationally identified and couldn't go home, had to kind of stay in one place. And my peers, other professionals who struggled to find their way in a very isolating time. So I don't want to do that again. That was rough. And the second part, something that I miss, I'm going to cheat on this one because during COVID, being a media person, we actually started these movie nights with a group of friends. And it was very low-key, lo-fi, on a platform where you could stream movies. And once a week, we just sat in front of our computers and like a dozen of us just got on a chat and watched a movie together. And we did this every Friday, the entire COVID isolation. We did that. And it was such a small thing, right? Just a group of friends getting together on chat and watching a movie. And we started with fun, like movies from the 70s and 80s, like fantasy movies, Conan the Barbarian, and like swords and sorcery fantasy movies, The Last Unicorn, all that fun stuff. The Dark Crystal, like just real out there stuff. Because our minds were we just needed to get out of what we were dealing with every day. The preciousness of that I miss. But the reason why this is a cheat is that this group still gets together. Still the same platform. We don't have video up or we're not making it complicated. Very low barrier to entry. You just make up a screen name, show up and chat, just like we did in the 90s. And then we show a movie. And literally we do this every Friday night. Our group is about 12 to 14 people. Sometimes there's only like 5 of us or 4 of us. Sometimes there's like 14 of us in there chatting away. How is everyone doing? So that's a cheat because we still do it. It just doesn't have the preciousness that it had, in 2020. But that's something that I will always cherish.
Love it. Well, thank you so much for joining us. It's always a pleasure. We always learn so much for you, and we're excited to have you back sometime soon.
Always, always such a pleasure to join your show. You both have been so welcoming of my work and have seen the value of what I do, and that means a lot. And that was just very natural. Sometimes I kind of had to convince people that this is important and critical work, but you got it right away. And that really means a lot to me to feel that I belong in your sphere of influence. So thank you so much for having me again.
Yes, for sure. Welcome back to Top Hat. This is the part of the episode where we dissect and analyze and investigate some of the epic learnings we got from this week's expert storyteller. But given the fact that this is our season 4 finale, we are going to do kind of a top hat for the season.
And we've had a truly diverse group of guests this season.
Yeah. Kev, this was a rather short season. We had a lot going on this year, but I'm so proud of this season. This season had such an eclectic group. Like, we jumped from topic to topic, but we still kind of kept that storytelling through line. There was episodes where we really harped in the power of storytelling. There was episodes where we just kind of listened and discussed and asked questions. And I think that's the power of this show, where we can be flexible with it, because we believe that storytelling is everything in everything we do. And I think every single episode made me a better storyteller, even if we didn't use the word storytelling 12,000 times.
Yeah, and I think from each and every one of our expert storytellers, we've learned incredible lessons. Well, for you, what are some of the lessons that stand out?
Let's start with Harvard Business School senior lecturer Christina Wallace. Christina was such an interesting guest, and she was our 2-part guest this season because we talked to her about her book and living a portfolio life like a financial terms. The story she's saying is, look at your life kind of like a investment of portfolios. You wouldn't put all in on one investment, because then you're too tied to that, and your emotions and your feelings and your life is tied to the ups and down swings of that investment. Why should we put our entire being into one thing or one or two things, whether it be our job or whether it be our favorite hobby or our podcast, right? It's more important to tell yourself the story of, I want to live a portfolio life. So you can have a few things that matter to you. So if something goes wrong, like Kevin, you and I have both been laid off in our lives, right? And at that time, for me especially, my job was a huge part of my identity, right? So losing that was really traumatic in a way. But if I lived a more portfolio life, losing that would have been hard. Don't get me wrong. Obviously, it's going to be a bigger part of my identity than some of the other things. But things like the podcast helped me get through it, because the podcast, something I had been doing at that time, was somewhere I can channel my energy as I looked for a new job. Having that a part of my life allows me to de-risk other parts. So I don't have to be so tied to my job or obsessed with my job, because I have that. Tell yourself that you are a human Venn diagram, as she put it. Tell yourself the story that you can put time into other things, even if it's not super productive. You should not be one thing, and that's storytelling.
Yeah, you don't have to start off with like a highly effortful secondary career to make it feel like you're living a diverse life. Start somewhere, build a hobby, something that brings you genuine joy and sense of achievement. As you develop further into that, that's going to add to the story you tell yourself, and it is going to give you a return that is going to be worth your investment in time and energy.
Yeah, that's the question we ask every guest. What's your story? So ask yourself, do you want your story to be heavily tied to one or two things? Or do you want to explore new things? I think this is an interesting thing we talked about with our first guest of the season, Nuala Walsh, who is an incredibly impressive person, worked at some of the world's most influential and important firms. And later in her career, she left her job, her very prestigious job, to get a master's degree. She made a big pivot that a lot of people wouldn't make, a lot of people would be afraid to make. But she realized that her story is not about being the chief marketing officer at this prestigious firm. Her story is about being the best Nuala Walsh she could be, right? And the same thing with living portfolio life. what's going to make you happiest.
And on that line of diversity, we have also continued this season to expand the types of storytelling mediums we consume. And of course, we've talked to storytellers like Prof. Noctis and also Jonathan Knight, head of games at New York Times, and really dug into gaming and video games as unique storytelling mediums in the sense that, when you're playing the video game, you have this unique advantage of really personally interacting with it and being part of the story yourself. And sometimes you are adding to the story or deciding on the outcome of the story based on your action in the games. And it brings you a different sense of agency. Experiencing and remembering the story from a first person point of view might help you understand the core message of the story in a very distinct way. And as we've talked to Prof. Noctis about, that's helped him in his teaching in religious theory using video games such as Final Fantasy 15. This is obviously a huge reason why we do this podcast, is to talk to more unique and unconventional storytellers about the types and mediums of storytelling they're passionate about. And also we talked to Professor Evan Fritz, right, about the history of bookstores, and just within this one classic storytelling mediums, there have been so many different genres of books, of stories, of ideas that were able to breed and evolve and spread throughout history. It again speaks to the importance of diversifying the stories that you consume.
Diversify the stories you consume. It's also really important to look back on your life with non-judgmental reflection. And that is, I think, one of the most important things we learned from one of my favorite guests of the season, Carrie's son, who wrote a gripping and amazing and lauded memoir called Private Equity, where she retold the story of working as an assistant in a high-powered hedge fund. We had finished her book. We did it in an audiobook, heard her voice telling her story. And it is so raw. It's so brave, But she talked about how she is a character in the book, right? It's the idea of protecting her memories, looking back on that time and with non-judgmental awareness and understanding the decisions she made, why she made them, how they got her to here. And even if she would have made a different decision now or wishes she could go back, it is important to acknowledge that you can't go back. At that time, she made the best decision she could, and she kept moving forward. And being able to look at that time and understand why you made those decisions and kind of forgive yourself, or just approaching it with no judgment, is just such an important part about personal storytelling. And I thought it was just a beautiful message we got from Carrie this season.
Yeah, I mean, this was the first time we really talked to someone who was writing a memoir, which is telling your own story in a very literal and public and important way.
Yeah, and it's a memoir that filled a niche in the industry, because when you read business memoirs, it's by titans talking about, this was a super successful career. This is a career you've envied. I am someone you love and respect, and you want to learn more. This is from the other end of the spectrum, where she's like, this is what it was like to be an assistant, not the CEO. So it was such an interesting thing about, again, diversity of storytelling.
Yeah, and Carrie's story, besides showing us what it takes to reflect on your own story and be able to tell it in a way that serves you, another key takeaway from that is also to be okay with being vulnerable, right? I think that's a very important message when it comes to understanding your own story.
I think a central theme for this season that we talked about is this idea that you are writing your own story and you're trying your best. Approach it with kindness and keep trying. That's all you can do. You're writing your own story, and every single person's story is beautiful. And so thank you so much for joining us this season. Kevin, 4 seasons done. We have released 4 seasons of this show, and we are not going anywhere. We just introduced a new theme song, and I definitely want to use it some more.
Yep. This has been the story of season 4 of Linen Suit and Plastic Tie podcast. We're so grateful for every one of our storytellers, our expert storytellers, for joining us where we can celebrate their stories and understand their insights. We're grateful for every one of you who have been listening and learning alongside with us on this quest of becoming a better storyteller. So, if you like what we do, if you like the stories you're hearing, make sure to subscribe and follow wherever you listen. Go to lsptpod.com for more of our information, where to find us on social media, where else you can listen to us. TikTok, Instagram, LinkedIn, we're there.
Make sure to follow, subscribe, share the show with a friend. Definitely leave a comment or review. It really helps people discover the show. It helps us get new guests. So if you like what we do, help bring more people on this journey of exploring and understanding the unexplainable, the amazing, the epic power of storytelling. We're all storytelling beings. It's what makes us human. And we absolutely cannot thank you enough for giving us your time. We know how important that resource is, and we're going to do whatever it takes to make it valuable.